I have told this story only once before, and that was to my brother himself, on the night he finally asked me what I had seen. He listened without speaking, his eyes on the fire, and when I finished he said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I know. I saw it too. I simply did not know what I was seeing." That is the most honest thing Edmund has ever said to me, and I have known him for 43 years. I am telling it now because it deserves to be told properly, and because I was there for all of it. The morning the arrangement was made, the weeks of cold silence that followed, the night everything changed, and the morning my brother finally understood what he had been given. My name is not important. I am the younger son, the unremarkable one, the brother who never inherited a dukedom and never wanted one. Edmund is the Duke of Velmore, the most feared duke in the eastern counties, if you believe the whispers at every assembly and dinner table from here to the coast. I believe them myself, for most of my life. He is tall and still and possessed of a quality that makes a room go quiet when he enters it. Not cruelty. I want to be precise about that. My brother has never been cruel. But he carries a gravity that people mistake for coldness, and he had, for the first 40 years of his life, done nothing to correct that mistake. It was easier to be feared than to be misunderstood. He told me that once. I thought it was the saddest thing he'd ever said. But I am getting ahead of myself. The arrangement began, as most arrangements do in our world, with money, or rather with the absence of it. Sir Walter Ashby had been a respected enough gentleman in the county for most of his life, and then, in the 3 years following his wife's death, he had become a desperate one. I do not know the exact sequence of his losses, whether it was the harvest failures, or the loans he had taken against the estate, or the investments his solicitor had urged upon him, and which had dissolved like salt in rain. What I know is that, by the spring of Edmund's 41st year, Sir Walter Ashby owed a very considerable sum to a very impatient creditor, and that creditor had begun making inquiries about the Ashby land. What Sir Walter had, besides the encumbered land and a house that needed its roof replaced, was a daughter. I did not know this when Edmund summoned me to his study on a Tuesday morning in April. I knew only that he looked, even by his own austere standards, particularly grim. He was standing at the window when I arrived, his hands clasped behind his back in the way he has when he is working through something he has already decided, but has not yet said aloud. "I am going to make an arrangement," he said, without turning. "I want you to know about it beforehand." I sat down without being asked, because my brother's study is the one room in Velmore Hall where I do not stand on ceremony. What kind of arrangement? Sir Walter Ashby's creditor is threatening attachment of the Ashby land. Ashby cannot cover the debt. He paused. I intend to settle it. I waited. Edmund does not settle strangers' debts out of sentiment. He does not, in fact, do anything out of sentiment, or so I had believed for most of our lives. In exchange, he continued, for his daughter's hand. The room was very quiet. Outside, one of the stable dogs was barking at something across the yard, and I could hear the faint knock of a shutter that had never been properly latched. I looked at my brother's back and thought of half a dozen things to say, and said none of them. "She is 24, Edmund said. Respectable by all accounts. Her mother was a gentlewoman. There is no scandal attached to her name." He turned then and looked at me with the expression I had learned over decades to read as something close to discomfort, though on Edmund's face discomfort looks like stone. "I require an heir. The estate requires a mistress. These are practical matters." "Yes," I said, "they are." "I thought you might argue." "I am thinking about whether to." He crossed the room and sat across from me, which was itself unusual. Edmund conducts most conversations from a standing position. "She does not know yet. Ashby will speak to her today." He said it as though he were reporting a fact about the weather, but I had known Edmund for 43 years, and I could hear, beneath the flatness, the thing he was not saying, that he was not easy about this. That he had found the practical necessity, and had made his decision, as he always did, by suppressing the discomfort and acting. "Does she have a choice?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "Ashby will present it as one." "That is not the same thing." "No," he said, "it is not." And that, I think, was the first moment, though I did not recognize it then, that my brother had stepped an inch outside the fortress of his own practicality. I met Rosalind Ashby 5 days later, when Edmund rode to the Ashby house to complete the formal arrangements and brought me along, I suspect, because he did not want to make the visit alone. He would never have said that. He said I might as well see the place, since I would be riding out this way in any case. I was not riding out that way in any case, but I came. The Ashby house was the kind of house that had once been handsome and was now tired, good bones, good proportions, but with the worn look of a property that has been surviving on reduced means for too long. The garden was tidy in the way that suggested someone cared but had no help. The drive was raked, but the gravel was thin. She came out to meet us herself, which surprised me. I had half expected a pale and frightened girl delivered by a hovering father. Instead, she walked out of the front door alone and came toward us across the gravel with a composure that I found, immediately and without quite knowing why, more affecting than either grace or beauty would have been. She was not conventionally lovely. She was slight, with dark hair pinned neatly back and a face that was more intelligent than pretty, good eyes, watchful, very steady. She was wearing a dark blue dress that was clean and well-made and not fine, and she held herself as though she were perfectly aware of every implication of the moment and had decided, somewhere in the preceding 5 days, that she would meet it upright. Edmund dismounted and stood before her, and she looked at him directly, not boldly but without flinching, and said, "Your Grace, thank you for coming. My father is inside. I hope you will come in." Not a word of welcome, not a word of pleasure, perfectly polite, perfectly composed, and not a syllable she did not mean. I watched my brother look at her, and I watched something shift in his expression, the faintest thing, a fraction of a second, and then the stone face returned. But I saw it. "Miss Ashby," he said and bowed, "thank you." The meeting with Sir Walter was brief and businesslike. The debt would be settled. The papers would be drawn up. The marriage would take place within the month, at the Ashby Parish Church, quietly. Sir Walter was effusive with relief and gratitude in the way of a man who has been frightened for a very long time and has just seen the danger pass. He shook Edmund's hand 3 times. He offered sherry. He thanked Providence and Edmund in roughly equal measure. Rosalind sat in the corner of the sitting room and said almost nothing. She answered when she was spoken to, and she answered clearly and briefly, and she looked at the fireplace when she was not being addressed. She did not look at Edmund. I do not think she looked at Edmund once in that whole hour with anything other than the sideways glance of someone taking a measurement, calculating a distance, a height, a mass, not fear, calculation. When we were leaving, Edmund paused in the hallway. They had been conducted to the door by Sir Walter, who had gone back to retrieve Edmund's gloves, which Edmund had deliberately left on the side table, and I was standing slightly behind my brother, and I watched him turn and look back at her. She was standing in the doorway of the sitting room, one hand on the frame, and she was looking at Edmund's back with an expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was not resentment, exactly. It was not despair. It was the face of a person who has very clearly, very privately, made their peace with something that has cost them a great deal, and who has decided that the peace itself will be their armor. Edmund turned away. Sir Walter returned with the gloves. We left. On the ride home, Edmund said nothing for 2 miles. Then he said, without looking at me, "She is steady." "Yes," I said. "Good," he said, and that was all. The wedding was quiet as arranged. 12 people at most, counting the vicar and the 2 elderly cousins of Sir Walter's who sat in the back and wept at everything regardless of occasion. Rosalind wore a cream-colored dress that was not quite a wedding gown, practical, elegant, hers. and she walked up the aisle on her father's arm and stood beside Edmund, and said her vows in a clear, level voice that did not waver once. Edmund said his vows in the same voice he uses when signing contracts. I stood to the side and watched them and thought, these are two people who have each decided to be brave, and neither of them has told the other. The first weeks at Velmore Hall were, by any honest account, very difficult. Edmund was not unkind. I want to be clear about that, because I have heard the story told in other households with other characters, and it is always the cruelty that people reach for, the harsh word, the coldness as weapon. Edmund was not cruel and he was not harsh. He was simply, comprehensively, unreachable. He ate dinner with his wife each evening and asked after her day in 3 words, and received her answer, and said something appropriate, and then returned to whatever internal terrain he had withdrawn to, which was large and well defended, and had no gate that anyone in 41 years had managed to find. Rosalind, to her immense credit, did not try to find it. She learned the house with the same quiet efficiency with which she had presumably learned everything else in her life. She met with the housekeeper and the cook and the groundskeeper. She asked sensible questions. She made small improvements, not imposing, not decorating, simply tidying the things that had frayed in the absence of a mistress, and doing it so unobtrusively that the staff noticed before Edmund did. The linen cupboard, the menus, which had been largely unchanged since their mother's time. A leak in the East Wing scullery that had been reported 3 times and not attended to, which Rosalind had attended to in her second week, by simply asking the housekeeper directly, and then following up. She was very good at following up. I visited often, more often than my usual habit, which Edmund noticed and did not comment on, because he knows me well enough to know that when I visit frequently, it means I am watching something. I played chess with Rosalind twice a week. She was a very good chess player, precise and unhurried, with a quality of attention that reminded me, in a way I did not immediately know what to do with, of Edmund's own quality of attention when he was genuinely engaged with something. She did not chatter over the board. She did not apologize for good moves. She played with the same composure she brought to everything, and when she had you cornered, she said so directly and without gloating, "I believe that's your king." She beat me the first time in under 40 minutes. I told Edmund and he said, which is his version of surprise. "Do you play?" I asked him. "I used to." "You should ask her." He looked at me across the dining table as though I had suggested he address the furniture. She would not want to be interrogated in her evenings. "She doesn't find it an interrogation," I said. "She finds it restful." I had asked her once what she liked best about the evenings at Velmore, and she had said, with the small directness that was characteristic of her, that she liked the quiet. Not emptiness, she had clarified that without being asked. Not the absence of company, but the quality of stillness, she said, that comes when a large house is settled and the day is done and no one requires anything of you. I had thought, hearing that she and Edmund were more alike than either of them yet knew. "We play in the evenings," I said, as casually as I could. "She anticipates well. She's patient with the endgame. You'd find it interesting." He said nothing, but 3 days later I came to Velmore for dinner and found them in the library, the chess board between them, both leaning slightly forward, Rosalind with her chin resting on her knuckled hand and Edmund with his left hand flat on the table and his right moving a rook. They were not speaking. The fire was going and the candles were lit, and the room had a quality of stillness that was, I realized with something shifting in my chest, different from the silence of the dinner table. That was absence, this was attention. This was 2 people in the same space, thinking about the same thing and not needing to fill it with words. I went away without interrupting them. I asked Rosalind, a week later, who had won. She gave me a composed little smile and said, "I did. He was not pleased." "Did he say so?" "Not in words, but he came back the next evening and asked for another game." A pause. "He won that one." And you? I came back the evening after. And she tilted her head fractionally. We have not finished the third game. Why not? We keep finding other things to discuss. She said it very levelly, but I saw the faintest color touch her cheek, and I understood that what she was describing was not an interruption but a development. That the chess was the occasion and the conversation was the thing, and that the third game had been abandoned night after night, candles burning lower, the fire settling, because they had found something more interesting to do with the time. I looked at her for a moment. She was sitting by the window of the morning room with a piece of mending in her hands and the afternoon light falling across her in a way that made her look, very briefly, young and almost soft, the careful composure still present but the edge of it gone, the way stone looks in low light when you can see through the hardness to the warmth of the grain. I thought, she is doing something very deliberate. She is not reaching for him. She is not flinching from him. She is simply being entirely herself, in his vicinity, and trusting that visibility to do what assault and retreat cannot. It was, I thought, one of the most intelligent and quietly courageous things I had ever watched anyone do. Edmund was not unaffected, though he would have denied it with his last breath in those early weeks. I knew him too well to miss it. The small signs were there. The way he began to arrive at dinner before she did rather than after, the way he had begun, without remarking on it, to leave the library in the state she preferred, the curtains open, the fire built up on the left rather than the right, where she sat. The way he listened, just a half-second longer than necessary, when she spoke at dinner. And then there was the afternoon with the horses. Edmund's stables are among the finest in the county. 3 of his horses have placed at the spring races, and one is the talk of every gentleman in 30 miles. Rosalind had said nothing about the horses in all her weeks at Velmore, because Rosalind, I had learned, said nothing about things she was not asked about and which were not her direct concern. She did not make claims on territory that had not been offered to her. But I happened to be in the yard one morning in early July when she came through the gate, alone, without a groom, which was unusual, and walked to the inn stall, where Edmund's most difficult horse was kept. The horse was a dark gray stallion named Meridian who did not, as a rule, tolerate anyone except Edmund and one particular stable hand. He had bitten the second undergroom twice, and had once put a kick through the wall of his stall, when a visiting gentleman's party had made too much noise. Rosalind stood at the stall door and looked at Meridian without moving. Meridian looked back. I watched from the far side of the yard, half expecting to call for help. She did not touch the horse. She did not speak to the horse. She simply stood there still, in the manner of a person who has all the time in the world and no agenda, and after perhaps 3 minutes the great gray horse took a step toward the door and lowered his head and breathed heavily, and then she raised one hand slowly from below, and Meridian pressed his nose into her palm. Edmund appeared in the stable door behind me and stopped. We both watched. She stood there with Meridian's nose in her hand, her head slightly bowed toward him, and then she said something quietly, a few words, too low to hear, and the horse blew out through his nose and took another step forward, and she ran her hand along the side of his neck. "How long has she been doing that?" Edmund asked. "I have no idea," I said honestly. "This is the first time I've seen it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He doesn't let anyone do that." "I know." Another silence. Then Edmund said, in a voice I had not heard from him in a very long time, careful and a little wondering, "Who showed her how to do that?" "I don't think anyone did," I said. "I think she already knew." He stood there a while longer, then he went inside. But that evening at dinner he asked her about the horse. Not in 3 words, in a full question with his eyes on her face, the way he asks questions when he actually wants an answer. And Rosalind set down her fork and looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and she answered him fully, with the matter-of-fact directness she brought to everything, and Edmund listened, really listened, in the way I had not seen him listen to anyone in years, and then he asked another question. And another. They talked about horses for 40 minutes. I am not certain either of them noticed how long it had been. I poured myself more wine and stayed very quiet and thought, there it is. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of Lady Barton. Lady Barton was, and I choose my words deliberately, one of those women whose entire sense of self depends upon the maintenance of a particular social order, which is to say an order in which she is near the top and others are placed, precisely and permanently, where she has decided they belong. She had known Edmund since childhood, had presumably at various points in her life hoped he might eventually choose her niece, and had greeted the news of his marriage to Rosalind Ashby with the expression of a woman who has bitten into a plum and found it underripe. She arrived at Velmore Hall in September, as part of a larger party that Edmund had been prevailed upon to host, the Varstow family and their connections, a week in the country, shooting and dinners, and the kind of social obligation that Edmund endures rather than enjoys. Lady Barton was attached to the party through her nephew, Lord Varstow, and she arrived in a carriage of conspicuous quality with 2 trunks and a maid, and the particular brightness of a woman who has identified a target and dressed for the occasion. The target was Rosalind. I watched it begin at the first dinner, the small cut, the kind that is invisible to anyone who is not watching closely. Lady Barton complimenting Miss Varstow's gown at length, in elaborate detail, in the same breath that she let her gaze pass over Rosalind's perfectly respectable blue silk as though it were not present. Lady Barton asking with a smile like pressed flowers whether Rosalind had found it very different, managing an establishment of this size after the Ashby house. Meaning, your father's ruined little house. Meaning, we know where you come from and what you owed. Meaning, you are here on borrowed terms, and we have not forgotten it. Rosalind answered everything pleasantly and revealed nothing. She was remarkably good at that, at receiving a small blade with the expression of someone who has been handed a flower, examining it with every appearance of appreciation, and setting it aside. She thanked Lady Barton for her interest. She said that yes, Velmore was very large, and that she had found the management of it both challenging and absorbing. She said this with such genuine directness that Lady Barton could not decide whether she had been answered or deflected, which was, I was beginning to understand, exactly how Rosalind wanted it. But I saw Edmund watching. He was seated at the head of the table, and he was, to any outward observer, engaged in conversation with Lord Varstow about the eastern coverts, yields and beaters, and the relative merits of 2 neighboring estates' pheasant populations. He was entirely present for that conversation. He answered each point. He asked the right questions. But his eyes moved, twice, to Rosalind's end of the table during Lady Barton's performances, and the second time they moved there, his hand on the tablecloth became very still. The particular stillness of a man who has heard something he will not immediately act upon but has registered completely. The second evening was similar, and I began to understand that Lady Barton was not improvising. She had a method, the compliment that excluded, the question that reminded, the anecdote about some mutual acquaintance's drawing-room that was constructed entirely to make Rosalind's silence feel like ignorance. It was practiced, and it was cruel in the way that practiced cruelty always is, deniable, surface-clean, and sharp enough that the wound does not show until later. Rosalind bore it. Not passively, she answered, she engaged, she managed, but I could see, in the set of her shoulders and the particular way she looked at the middle distance when she was not being directly addressed, that it was costing her something. The breaking point came on the 3rd evening. There had been a dinner and then a gathering in the drawing-room, and the company had arranged itself into the natural formations of such evenings. Card tables and conversation clusters, and 3 people near the piano debating whether to play. Somewhere in the latter part of the evening, Lady Barton positioned herself beside Rosalind near the window and made a remark. I was half a room away but moving nearer, because I had learned by this point to keep myself within range, That was aimed at Rosalind's origin with a precision that even Lady Barton's considerable practice at deniability could not quite cover. I heard the end of it clearly. But of course, it must be very different when one has not grown up in these rooms. One cannot quite acquire the instinct for it, I suppose. It is a thing one is born to, or one is not. The words fell into a small silence. Not a large one. There were still 3 conversations going on, and the card players at the far table were still dealing and disputing a trick. But the silence had the quality of something held. The people nearest had heard, and they were waiting. Rosalind sat with her hands folded in her lap and a look on her face that was perfectly still, like a pool in windless air. And she said, "You may be right, Lady Barton. I have found a great many things here that I did not expect, and I cannot be certain yet how much of it comes of instinct and how much of careful attention." A small pause. Lady Barton began to smile, beginning to believe she had drawn blood. "The library, for instance," Rosalind said, in the same pleasant, unhurried voice. "I did not know it was so extensive. I have been working through the natural histories on the east wall in particular. There are several volumes I had not encountered before, and at least one I believe may be quite rare. I am not certain they are widely known beyond the specialist." She looked at Lady Barton with complete composure. "Have you a particular interest in natural history, Lady Barton? I would be very glad to show you the collection tomorrow if so." Lady Barton had no particular interest in natural history, and this was so evident to every person in listening range that the offer was, in its politeness, devastating. There was nowhere to go from it. Say yes, and be shown the library by the woman she had just condescended to. Say no, and the condescension evaporated. She said something gracious and hollow, and the conversation moved on, and Rosalind turned serenely to the woman on her other side and asked after her garden, and the incident was over. Rosalind had not retreated. She had not risen to it. She had answered the blade with a question that made the whole shape of the blade visible, so clearly that Lady Barton could not, in front of company, be seen to pursue it without exposing herself entirely. She had done it without raising her voice, without heat, without so much as a narrowed eye. I looked across the room at Edmund. He was standing by the fireplace with a glass in his hand, and he was looking at his wife with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not the evaluating look, the measuring, deciding, placing look he gave to most things and most people. Something else entirely. Something that was, if I am honest, the look of a man who has just seen, with sudden and complete clarity, the full worth of something he has been holding in his hands for months without knowing what it was. It was there on his face with a nakedness that was extraordinary in Edmund, whose face keeps its own counsel almost absolutely. Something had arrived at the surface, some knowledge, newly recognized, that would not go back down. I had to look away before he caught me. When the company retired for the evening, Edmund did not follow immediately. I stayed behind, or rather I was too slow in leaving, occupied with pouring a last glass of wine and setting down my cards, and I saw him cross the room to where Rosalind was standing by the window, looking out at the dark garden where the frost was just beginning to show on the grass below the terrace. He stood beside her. She did not turn. "She has been doing this for 3 days," he said, not loudly, quietly, with the restraint of a man who has decided on an exact and minimum force. "It is nothing I cannot manage," Rosalind said. "I know you can manage it." A pause in which the fire cracked and settled. "That is not the point." She turned then and looked at him. In the firelight, with the room emptied and the candles burning lower in their sconces, she looked different from how she looked at dinner or across the chessboard or in the morning room. Not softer. Rosalind was not soft. I do not think she had ever had the luxury of softness, but more present, more real, as though the surface she wore in company, the composed and careful and perfectly judged surface, was still there but thinner, and something that had always been behind it was now visible through it. Something patient and tired and quietly proud. "What is the point, then?" she asked. Edmund looked at her for a moment, that long, still, absolute look that he usually reserves for things he is deciding, and then he said, "You should not have to manage it at all. Not in your own home." The words fell between them, your own home. He had not said that in all the months of their careful and circling arrangement. Not once, not even in passing, not even in the casual way that becomes habit. He had said my estate, my house, Velmore, the hall. He had not said your home. I do not think he had known until that moment that the word was his to give, that he had given it in his choosing of her, and had not yet recognized what he'd done. Rosalind looked at him. Her composure held the line of her mouth, the set of her shoulders, but her eyes did something I cannot precisely describe. It was not softening. It was not breaking. It was more like a held breath released. Something that had been waiting behind the steadiness. Not resentment, not despair, not hope exactly, but the particular vigilance of someone who has been careful for so long they have almost forgotten why that thing let go. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. Edmund nodded. He was still looking at her with that new expression, the one I had no word for except to call it what it was, regard, real regard, the kind that has no calculation in it. "I will speak to Lady Barton tomorrow." "You don't need." "I will speak to her tomorrow," he said again, and there was something in his voice that stopped her argument before it could form. It was not the authority of the Duke of Velmore, the voice people associated with his title and his power and his feared man reputation. It was something quieter than that and stronger, the voice of a man who has decided what he values and means to protect it. He left the room. I sat very still in my chair by the fire, holding my wine glass, which I suspect neither of them had remembered was occupied. I listened to the house settle around the absence of them, the creak of a floorboard, the distant soft closing of a door, and I thought about everything I had watched across the previous 8 months. I had seen it clearly for some time. I had seen it building, but something had crystallized tonight. Some threshold had been crossed. I named it finally, sitting alone in Edmund's drawing room at 11 o'clock with the fire going down. He was in love with her. He did not yet know the word for it, or rather, he knew the word but had not yet applied it to himself, because Edmund does not apply words to himself carelessly, and love is not a word he has ever used carelessly. But he was entirely, irreversibly in love with his wife, and had been for some time, and the only person in Velmore Hall who did not yet know it was Edmund himself. He spoke to Lady Barton the next morning. I do not know what he said exactly. I was not in the breakfast room when he did it, and Edmund did not repeat the conversation to me, and he would not have. What I know is that Lady Barton was, at her appearance at the breakfast table 20 minutes later, visibly and completely chastened in the way of a person who has been told, very quietly and without anger, precisely where they stand. She spent the remainder of the house party in a state of elevated, effortful cordiality toward Rosalind that was almost painful in its transparency, and she did not attempt another remark of that character for the rest of her stay. Edmund came to breakfast looking like a man who has discharged a duty and has no regret about it, not triumphant, not vindicated, simply settled. And when Rosalind came in and took her seat and looked at him across the table, she held his gaze for a moment longer than she had ever done before. The corner of her mouth moved, not a smile exactly, and not a performance for the room. Something private between them only, the language of two people who have begun, without quite announcing it, to speak to each other in a way that everyone else can see but no one else can read. After the house party left, the autumn changed. I do not know how to describe it more precisely than that. The air in the house was different, not warmer exactly, not softer but easier. The particular quality of tension that had lived in the spaces between Edmund and Rosalind, the careful distances they kept, the managed silences, the 3-word inquiries and 2-sentence answers of the early months, had shifted, as a river shifts when an obstruction is removed, Not suddenly and not with drama, but with a gradually increasing ease and direction. They still played chess in the evenings. They still had dinner. But something had loosened, and what had loosened had begun to become, quietly and without anyone declaring it, something else. Edmund asked her questions. Real ones, not, "How was your day?" and "Is the linen satisfactory?" but the questions of a man genuinely curious about the interior of another person. He asked her about her education, who had taught her and what she had been given to read, and whether her father had been the kind of man who took that seriously. He asked her what she made of the East Wing renovation he was planning, and whether she thought the architect's proposal made sense. And when she told him directly that she thought one part of it did not, he listened without interruption and then said, "Show me which part." She did. He reconsidered. The architect was asked to revise. She asked him questions in return. She asked about the history of the estate, not the social history, the names of previous dukes and their achievements, the kind of thing that gets presented to a new wife as background, but the working history. The fields, the drainage, the decisions made across 3 generations about what to plant and where, and which of those decisions had proved right. She asked why the north pasture had been left unworked. He told her the reason, a drainage problem that predated him, and she thought about it and then, 2 days later, came to him with a suggestion based on something she had read in one of the natural history volumes in the East Library. And he took it seriously, and they tried it, and it worked. I heard about this from the head groundskeeper, who told me with an air of stunned approval that the Duchess had proposed the solution to a problem they'd had for 30 years. She read it in a book, he said, in the tone of a man who has revised a firmly held opinion. Edmund, I discovered when I asked him about it directly, had told no one. He had simply implemented the solution and noted it in the estate ledger and said nothing about where the idea had come from. When I asked him why, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Because it was her idea. I didn't want it absorbed into mine." I thought about that for a long time. He began to tell her things beyond the practical, things he told no one, which is to say things he had never told me, and I had never expected to hear from anyone who knew my brother. The argument he'd had with the county magistrate about the Eastern Road that had left him quietly furious for a week. The disagreement with his solicitor that he had won on paper, but was not certain he had been right to win. The particular field on the western edge of the estate that had belonged, before the current boundaries, to a family whose descendants were now gone, and the fact that this troubled him in a way he had never found a way to explain. Rosalind listened. She was a magnificent listener, not passive, not simply receiving, but present and particular in the way that means nothing is filed away or forgotten. She brought things back at exactly the right moment. She remembered the name of the magistrate 3 weeks later and asked how that had resolved. She remembered the field and one evening quietly set a small book on the library table where Edmund would find it, a local history, found in the estate library that included the family whose descendants were gone. No comment, just the book, open to the relevant passage. He read it. He did not mention it to her for 2 days. Then, at dinner, he said, "Where did you find the Alverstone history?" "Third shelf from the bottom, east wall," she said. "I thought it might be the right one." He looked at her. "It was," he said, "thank you." And that was all. But something in the way he said it, the particular directness, the tone of a man who has been given something he did not know how to ask for, meant that I, who was present at the dinner and watching, heard rather more than those 2 words. She was, I realized over those October and November weeks, exactly the person Edmund had needed beside him for a very long time, not because she completed him in the storybook sense, not because she was his opposite or his reflection, but because she was genuinely his equal in the things that mattered most to him. Steadiness, honesty, and the willingness to think hard about hard things without requiring the hard things to become easy. She did not expect Edmund to be comfortable. She expected him to be honest. He was, I think, profoundly relieved by the difference. I told her as much. Not all of it. I am not a man who produces whole confessions when a portion will do, but one afternoon over chess, when Edmund was out riding and the rain had closed in against the windows, and the morning room had the particular warmth of a room that is genuinely inhabited, I put down my bishop and said that I was glad he had her. She looked at me across the board with those watchful dark eyes, and she said quietly, "You were kind to me from the very beginning. I noticed." "Edmund noticed too," I said. "He is more aware than he appears." She moved a pawn and said nothing, and I saw the color in her face change, not dramatically, just that faint shift that tells you something has been felt and is being carefully managed. I understood then, and not for the first time, that the composure was not armor against feeling. It was the shape that feeling took in someone who had learned, young and from necessity, that feeling unmanaged makes you vulnerable in ways you cannot afford. She felt everything. She simply held it very still. "He is a careful man," she said at last. "He is," I said, "but not a cold one, despite what most people think, despite what he sometimes thinks himself." She looked at me for a moment. "No," she said quietly. "Not cold." A pause, and then very low, "I think he has been alone for a very long time." "Yes," I said, "he has." She turned back to the board, and I did not press, and we played the endgame in the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other. But I carried what she had said with me for the rest of the day, because in it I had heard something she had not meant to show me. She was not simply enduring this marriage, or managing it, or making the best of it. She was watching him with the close attention of a woman who has begun to care about what she sees. The winter ball was Edmund's idea. This was, in itself, remarkable. Edmund had not hosted a formal ball at Velmore Hall in 11 years, not since our mother was alive, and the house had been run by someone who enjoyed that kind of event. He had attended them, as duty required, and he had found them faintly tedious, and he had managed his tedium by being very still and very authoritative and leaving before the supper. He told me about it in November. In the same matter-of-fact tone, he had used to tell me about the arrangement in April, except that it was entirely different, because in April he had been avoiding something and in November he was leaning toward it. "I am holding a winter ball," he said, "in December, a large one." I looked at him. "Why?" "Rosalind has not yet been formally introduced to the county." A pause. "She should be." "Properly." I considered this. "She has met most of the county at various dinners." "Not as my wife, not the way she should have been from the beginning." He was looking at the fire. "I did this poorly, the introduction, the beginning of it." "Edmund." "I did it poorly," he said again, and the simplicity of it, the willingness to say it, which was not a thing my brother did easily, stopped me. "She came here without ceremony, and I received her without ceremony, and I let the county draw its own conclusions about what kind of marriage this was." "And what kind of marriage is it?" I asked carefully. He looked at me then, and I saw in his face the thing I had been watching arrive for months. Not a declaration, not a confession, but a certainty. The settled look of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. "It is the best thing that has happened to me," he said, "and I have not told her so." I said nothing. I was fairly certain that anything I said would be wrong. "I do not know how to tell her," he said. I was not prepared for her to be." He stopped, tried again. "I did not expect to find her indispensable." "Rosalind," I said carefully, "is a very intelligent woman. I suspect she has noticed more than you think." He looked at me. "You believe she knows?" "I believe," I said, "that she has been hoping, and that she is not at all certain her hope is warranted." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The ball, I want it to be right." The ball was on the 14th of December. Edmund had said a large one, and he had meant it. 200 invitations went out, and 200 people came, because when the most feared Duke of Velmore hosts a ball for the first time in 11 years, the county does not decline. The hall was lit with hundreds of candles. I counted, at one point, and stopped when I reached 400 because there were still more. And the floors had been polished to a mirror, and the orchestra was the best available within 30 miles, and the supper tables were a statement in their own right. But what I remember is this: Rosalind coming down the stairs. She was wearing a gown of deep blue-green silk, the color of a winter sea, and her dark hair was dressed simply, with no elaborate ornament, a string of pearls, and that was all. She was not arrayed for conquest. She was simply, entirely, and without apology herself, the same steady, quiet woman who had walked across that gravel drive in a plain dark dress 8 months ago, except that tonight she was not bracing herself. Tonight she looked, and I am choosing the word carefully because it is the right one, at ease. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked around the hall, and I saw on her face a brief, unguarded thing that she quickly smoothed away. The look of someone who has walked into the life they had not dared to want. Edmund was at the foot of the stairs. He had been there for 10 minutes. I know this because I had been watching him stand there, very still, his eyes on the staircase, with the expression of a man who has decided something and is waiting for the moment to act on it. When she came down and reached the last step and looked at him, he offered his arm formally, as he always did, and she took it, and they stood there for a moment in the candlelight before the gathering guests. And then Edmund did something I had not seen him do in 43 years of observation. He leaned slightly, toward her just slightly, just a fraction, and said something, low enough that no one else could hear. I was close enough. He said, "You look like you belong here." And then before she could answer he said, "Because you do." I watched her face. I saw the composure hold, and I saw the thing beneath it, the hope he had not known he was answering, come right to the surface, just for a second, undisguised and unarmored. Her eyes were bright. She looked at him, and the look on her face was not gratitude and it was not relief, though it was partly both of those things. It was recognition, the look of a woman who has been seen. She said very quietly, "I think you belong here too, you simply forgot." Edmund looked at her for a moment, and then, and I will hold this image for the rest of my life, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. Edmund does not produce full smiles without long preparation, but the beginning of one, genuine and ungoverned. "Perhaps," he said, "you will remind me." "I intend to," she said. And then the guests arrived in earnest, and the music began, and the evening opened around them, and I stepped back and let it happen. I watched them all night. I watched Edmund lead her onto the floor for the first dance he danced, which he had not done at any formal occasion in a decade, and I watched the county watch them. The assembled opinion of 200 respectable county families, arrayed in all its candle-lit splendor, watched the most feared Duke of Velmore dance with his wife, and what they saw was not the cold arrangement they had privately whispered about for 8 months. What they saw was a man who had found something of value and knew it. Lady Varstow told her neighbor that the Duchess was remarkably handsome. The neighborhood squire, who had been skeptical in April, told another squire that the Duke seemed remarkably well. 2 of the older ladies on the far side of the room, who had been at Velmore Hall when Edmund's mother was alive, exchanged a quiet look and nodded to each other, and one of them dabbed her eyes. I found a corner and a glass of wine and felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely content. Rosalind danced twice with Edmund, and once with Lord Varstow, and once with the squire's eldest son, and she received each introduction and each compliment with the same steady warmth she brought to everything, and she remembered every name and asked each person one question that made them feel noticed, and by the end of the evening I had heard her described as charming, sensible, remarkable, and exactly what he needed, and every one of those descriptions was correct. Edmund stayed until the very last guest had gone, which is not something the most feared Duke of Velmore has ever done at anyone's ball. He stood at the door and bade farewell to each guest, and then, When the hall was finally empty and the candles were burning low and the orchestra was packing away, he came to find me. He looked lighter. That is the only word, as though something that had been pressing on him, something old and very heavy, had been set down. "Well," he said. "You already know," I said. "I want to hear you say it." I looked at my brother, this grave, still, impenetrable man who had spent 41 years inside his own fortress, and I said, "You are happy." He held my gaze for a moment. "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification or disclaimer, which was, from Edmund, as close to astonishment as I have ever witnessed. "I am." I asked him then, because someone had to, and I had been his witness all year, what he intended to do about it. He looked at me as though the answer were entirely obvious. "I intend to tell her," he said. "Now." He glanced toward the staircase. Rosalind had gone up a quarter-hour before, after the last guest, with a quiet word to the housekeeper, and a look back at Edmund that she perhaps thought he had not seen. He had seen it. "Now," he said. He found her in the library, her library, as I had come to think of it, because she had made it hers in the way she had made everything at Velmore hers, quietly and completely and without displacement. She was sitting by the fire with her shoes beside the chair and her hair slightly undone from its pins, and she had a book open in her lap, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that tried to arrange itself into composure and didn't quite manage it. I know this because he told me later what he saw. He told me that he stood in the doorway of the library and looked at her by the fire, the silk gown and the loose hair and the book, and the face she could not quite settle into its usual stillness, and that he understood all at once the full and irreversible nature of what had happened to him, not as a surprise, not as an arrival, as a recognition, as though he were seeing clearly for the first time something that had been present for months. He told me he said her name. Just her name, Rosalind, the way you say a word that has become important without your knowing it. She stood up from the chair and looked at him, and he crossed the room and stood before her and said, "I made a practical arrangement. I told myself it was practical because I did not know what else to call it. I had not yet learned the word for what I was actually doing." She was very still. "What were you actually doing?" she asked. He told me he took her hand then, her right hand, both of his, and said, "Seeking the one person in the world I would not be alone with." And she looked at him, and her composure gave way entirely, and she said, "I did not come here expecting to be happy. I want you to know that I did not expect it." "Nor did I," he said. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he said. I know what happened next only in outline, because Edmund is my brother and not a storyteller, and there are things between a man and his wife that belong to them alone. What I know is that when I left Velmore that night the library fire was still burning, and the light was on under the door. The morning I came back, 2 days later, the house had a different quality about it. Not loud, Velmore Hall is never loud, but full, in the way a house is full when the people in it are no longer maintaining careful distances from each other. The housekeeper smiled at me in the hallway. The stable hand whistled in the yard. Edmund came to meet me himself, which he never does, and he looked, I will say it plainly, like a man who has come home to himself, open in the face, unhurried, steady in the way that is warmth, not granite. "She beat me at chess last night," he said, by way of greeting. "She usually does," I said. "I know," he held the door. "She is teaching me to lose with more grace." I laughed, which surprised us both, and he smiled, a full one this time, ungoverned, and we went inside. Rosalind was in the morning room with Meridian's winter feed schedule spread on the desk and a cup of tea cooling beside her, and she looked up when we came in with the expression of a woman entirely at home, which is to say, with the quiet brightness of someone who has been given something they had long since stopped thinking to ask for. She told me I was staying for dinner. She asked after my journey. She poured more tea. Edmund stood by the window and watched her with a look on his face that I had never seen on my brother in 43 years, and that I can only describe as gratitude pure, uncomplicated, and not a little humbled. The debt had long since been settled. The debt had never, for Edmund, been the point. What I have tried to tell, and what I hope I have managed to say somewhere in all of this, is the thing my brother told me when I asked him, months later, what he would say to the man he had been on that Tuesday morning in April when he had stood at his window and called it practical. He thought for a moment. The fire was going. Rosalind was upstairs. The house was quiet around us. I would say, Edmund said, that I was right, that it was necessary. I was wrong about which necessity. He looked at the fire. I needed the estate run. I needed an heir. Those things were true. A pause. But what I actually needed, what I had needed for a very long time, was someone who would stand still in the same room with me and not flinch. Someone who would beat me at chess and mean it. Someone who would walk up to my most difficult horse and not make a sound until he came to her. He paused again, longer. I did not know that was what I was looking for. I do not think I would have known how to look for it deliberately. And now, I said. He looked up from the fire. Now, he said, with the simplicity of a man who has stopped being afraid of the plain truth, I know exactly what I have. Outside, across the winter garden, a light came on in the upstairs window of Velmore Hall, the library window, where Rosalind read in the evenings when the day's work was done. Edmund saw it. I watched him see it. I watched the expression on his face, and I thought of everything I had witnessed in the past 12 months, and I did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. The debt was paid. The arrangement was made. And neither of them, not for a single day of the rest of their lives, called it a debt or an arrangement again.